Okay, guys, so now let's talk about the relationship between energy and frequency. So we have a triangle for this guy as well, and it is E equals H times V. Now remember, V is still your frequency, okay, and still meaning that was the same when we were talking about wavelength. E is now in your energy. We want to remember energy is going to be measured in joules. And then we've got H, and H is my Planck's constant. Okay, and this is going to be 6.626 times 10 to the negative 34. And my unit for this is joules times seconds. Okay, so we want to remember this as we start solving for everything. Let me rewrite that triangle because it's going to be really helpful to know our units of measure. Okay, so when we look at the problem we're given, it says, what is the energy? Okay, so right off the bat, I know my equation is solving for energy. So remember, if we're using a triangle, if we cross out what we're looking for, what is left is the equation. So it's going to be, so if I cross out E, I'm left with H next to V. And so remember, in math, when they're next to each other, you multiply. Okay, so let's get rid of this little triangle because I'm going to need a lot of room. So we're going to be multiplying. Now, before we go any further, let's look at what else we're given. We are given this 3.212, times 10 to the 18th seconds with a negative 1. Now remember, this seconds with a negative 1 is the same thing as saying per second or hertz. And so this is my unit of measure for frequency. Okay, now generally again, I use the per second because I think it's not quite as scary looking. I find a lot of times students get a little concerned when we have a negative exponent. So we're solving for energy. We've got this. Now this given number, the 3.12, this is going to be 3 sig figs. So once we plug our numbers in and we solve, we do want to make sure we're rounding to those 3 sig figs. Okay. So again, H is my constant. So it's 6.626 times 10 to the negative 34. This is joules times seconds. And we're multiplying that. I'm just going to do a big X so that we don't lose my dot. Times 3.12 to the 10 to the 18th per second. Okay, now when I plug this into the calculator, remember I want 3 sig figs, so I am going to get 2.07 times 10 to the negative 15. Oh, let me space that out a little bit. Okay, now if you're looking at your units, remember if you have the same unit on the top and on the bottom, then they cancel out. And that's what we've got. Because remember, we have joules times seconds on the bottom. So my seconds are going to cancel out. So you can always work out the units of measure. But I find it's just a lot of times easier to remember that anytime you're working with energy, energy's unit of measure is going to be joules. So this is my answer. Okay, now let's do one that's a little more challenging where we may have to use both equations. Okay, so let's see. Okay, let's do this one. All right, so when we are looking at this equation, let's identify what we're solving for. We are solving for wavelength. Okay, and we know that our equation for wavelength is, hold on, let me make sure I don't write outside my box. Okay, sorry. That our equation for wavelength is wavelength equals C over V. Okay, so I know I'm solving for wavelength, and so I'm going to need to plug into this equation. But when I look back at what I'm given, I am given 1.528 times 10 to the negative 13 joules. But remember, we need this frequency. So if you look back at your other triangle, we have E, H, and V. And do you remember which unit of measure was joules? Remember, it's not velocity, it's not frequency. Frequency is per second. Our Planck's constant is joules times second, but energy is in fact joules. So guys, we need to make sure, that we understand and that we notice that what we are given here is energy. So here's the problem. We really need frequency. But if we're given energy, we can in turn solve for frequency because we know our other triangle can solve for frequency. If we're solving for, for frequency. Frequency is E over H. Well, remember guys, H is a constant, so we know H. Do we have enough information for E? Totally, we're given E. So when we plug this into the equation, it's going to be 1.528 times 10 to the negative 13 joules over my Planck's constant, 6.626 times 10 to the negative 34, and that's joules times seconds. Do you see what I just did? Now, when I solve for this, let's see, we want to make sure we are looking at those four. Okay, so my calculated answer for this, and again, we're looking for 4 sig figs, it's going to be 2.306 times 10 to the 20th. Now remember, this isn't like my answer in the end, because we're just solving for frequency at the moment, but frequency would be per second. Okay, now guys, again, this is my V. The question does not ask me for V. Okay, the question asks me for wavelength. So let's erase all of this work now that we've solved V. But with this information, we can easily say, figure out what our wavelength is. So if we have our constant as 3.00 times 10 to the 8th meters per second, we just determined our frequency is 2.306 times 10 to the 20th per second. And now we just solve for it. Now remember, again, we want to stay to those 4 sig figs. Okay, so again, remember, now we are actually solving for our wavelength. Okay, so my answer for this, let me make sure I'm right. Okay, so remember guys, we want to go to the 4 sig figs. So my calculated answer here for my wavelength, because now that's what I'm actually solving for, is 1.301 times 10 to the negative 12. Now remember, it did ask for wavelength. So since this is a length, we're going to be measuring it in meters. Now, please understand, guys, when you get to higher chemistry or to college, you will often be asked about a nanometer. Now, we're not going to worry about that at the moment. We are just making sure that we have the basic foundational concept, because then going to nanometers isn't that much more challenging than what we've already covered. So remember, if you have any questions or concerns, or if you need any help on any specific problems, please shoot me an email or let me know in class. Thanks, guys.